Welcome back to the Project Censored show. I'm your host, Mickey Huff, in studio with Chase Palmieri. On this segment of the program, we are joined again by the independent journalist Abby Martin at MediaRoots.org, also the force behind the Empire Files. And Abby Martin joined us not long ago on the Project Censored show to talk about various things, including online censorship. She was also one of the keynote speakers at the Media Freedom Summit last October. And Abby Martin also has a history of reporting on South America and Venezuela, and that's going to be the topic of our discussion in this segment of the show, though, of course, Abby Martin is quite well-rounded. We might riff on a few other things, but I know that Venezuela is a very pressing issue, and Abby Martin agreed to take time out of her busy schedule, and she is now with us at the Project Censored show. Abby Martin, thank you for joining us.
Wouldn't miss it, Mickey. Thanks for having me.
So what's going on with the coup d'etat in Venezuela?
Well, Mickey, if you were watching the corporate media, you wouldn't think it's a coup at all. You would think that this is democracy, because coups can lead to democracy. Look, this is a coup like there's never been a coup before. It is not only a coup, it's one of the most brazen, blatant coup attempts in modern history, resurrecting the Monroe Doctrine when the U.S. empire thought that it can assert its hegemony and decide the future of these independent Latin American states that were emerging. So let's just break down what's going on. I mean, we have Juan Guaido, a person who was self-elected to the National Assembly, kind of akin to, let's just say, Congress in the U.S. They have elections multiple times a year. It's one of the countries with the most elections in Latin America, so odd for a dictatorship to have so many elections every year, not just presidential, gubernatorial, mayoral, the list goes on and on. So Juan Guaido was basically elected president of this body, not even from an election. He was kind of appointed by a small elite cabal within the National Assembly. Now, this body kind of has similar ratings to the popularity that Congress does in the U.S. In fact, when you poll Americans, they like cockroaches more than they do Congress, kind of similar to Venezuela. It has a 70% disapproval rating, the body that just elected this random guy president of the country. Now let's compare that to Nicolas Maduro, who won a second presidential term in a free and fair election, monitored by hundreds of independent electoral observers, won with 6 million votes, trounced the next competitor with 5 million votes. We have, again, observers from all over the world verifying that these elections are fair and free. We're talking about a country with 30 million people. 20 million of those people are eligible voters. 6 million of those eligible voters voted for Maduro. So when you look at who Juan Guaido is, he's much more known in the elite circles of Washington, D.C., where he came and attended prestigious elite universities, got 2 degrees. His school mascot was called the Colonials, believe it or not. Much more well-known in these elite circles of the Marco Rubios and the Mike Pences than he is in Venezuela, where before he declared himself president, 80% of Venezuelans had no idea who he was. And it's really amazing because he didn't just pop out of the blue. He's been working hand in glove with the U.S. empire and its regime change proxy fronts, the Organization of American States, National Endowment for Democracy, and the USAID over the last 10 years. While they've been giving tens of millions of dollars to fund the opposition, this guy has been heavily involved in these opposition street battles where there's fascistic violence, where it leads to multiple Chavistas getting lynched, multiple socialist enclaves getting targeted, firebombed. My own colleague from Telesur was shot in the back by one of these opposition protesters. So he was intimately involved in those, what they're called guarimbas. He's closely aligned with another opposition leader, Leopoldo Lopez, who you hear ad nauseum from the corporate media. Oh, he couldn't run against Maduro in the elections because they jailed the opposition. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that the U.S. would jail the opposition here if they tried to violently overthrow the elected U.S. government, because that's what this guy did. He tried to violently overthrow Maduro several times, and he's not even in jail. He's on house arrest. So this is where this guy comes from. This is the world and kind of the sphere that he comes from. And when you compare him to Maduro, they really quite represent that class struggle pretty viscerally. You have Juan Guaido, an elite, prestigious D.C. born and bred guy, propped up by the U.S. establishment, and then Nicolas Maduro, a bus driver who's been a worker his whole life. And they pretty starkly represent the class struggle that's pretty dynamically apparent in Venezuela right now, Mickey.
Well, Abby Martin, pretty much everything that you just said, well, you're not going to read that in the New York Times. You're not going to see that in the Washington Post, and certainly on the cable networks, the television news. If you could sum up or encapsulate for us, what are some of the things that we're hearing about the Maduro government, that millions of people in the street are opposing him, that he's a dictator, that he was illegitimately put into office? I mean, there's a whole narrative of trying to undermine the government of Venezuela, while simultaneously U.S. banks and financial interests are trying to control the oil there.
Absolutely. I just saw John Bolton, I think on Fox News, just openly saying we want to seize the oil. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. Largest in the world. More than Saudi Arabia. And interestingly enough, Mickey, compare the coverage of Venezuela to Saudi Arabia. We don't call their regime illegitimate. We don't call them a dictatorship, a brutal monarchy that's tyrannically repressing, beheading dissidents in the street when they're not busy dismembering journalists and then getting a pat on the back from Trump. Trump just seemed more annoyed that he didn't cover it up enough.
Well, you couldn't get in the way of the $110 billion arms deal so they could continue the proxy war in Yemen. I mean, this is realpolitik writ large right in front of your faces. They're not even hiding it.
Exactly. It's so brazen, Mickey, and we can get into who Elliot Abrams is in a second.
Yeah.
This self-declared, liaison again, resurrecting the Monroe Doctrine, resurrecting this kind of Reagan death squad regime change operations that were going on in the 80s. They've just implemented the worst guy. It's almost like they just are rubbing it in our faces at this point, Mickey. But you asked about the corporate media coverage, and this is very important because you look at RT, you look at Telesur, you look at a lot of state-run media and international media around the world. They do tell a larger, more complicated, complex story because that's what Venezuela is. It's not black and white. It's obviously very complicated on the ground, especially when you're talking about the economic crisis, the economic war, how hyperinflation works. It's a little bit complicated for people, and it's important to construe and articulate that in a comprehensive way. Well, when you look at the corporate media, it is literally an extension of the Pentagon. It makes sense when you realize that we live in a corporate state and we don't actually live in a free and fair democracy, so of course we're not going to have a free and fair media when it's subsidized by banks, oil corporations, and defense contractors. So you look at someone like John Bolton boasting about how we want to seize the oil from Venezuela, but then you look at the quote-unquote liberal media, Mickey, they are just masking all of this in humanitarianism. But they are all pushing Trump from the right. They love this. All of a sudden, the narrative becomes completely lockstep. Any time that we're talking about maintaining U.S. empire or expanding U.S. empire or developing militarism around the world, they completely stand in line and are uniformly lockstep with the administration. It is quite fascinating. So the New York Times, look back 100 years ago when they were whitewashing Hitler. Look back 50 years ago when they were whitewashing Pinochet and actually claiming Salvador Allende was a dictator who was mismanaging his economy, not mentioning that the CIA was waging an economic war there to, quote, make the economy scream. So fast forward to today, harping on Russia ad nauseum, nonstop. They actually had the audacity, Mickey, to say the Russia alleges that this is a U.S.-backed coup and that Maduro's backed by Russia. Russia backed Maduro. No, Maduro's backed by Venezuelans. And reality is not a Russian talking point. So that's where we're at. We're getting gaslit by corporate media saying not only is this not a coup, not only is this a democratic measure, that's a Russian talking point, Mickey, to say it's a coup. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, it's so bold and in your face, and people are just lapping it up because similarly to North Korea, you can really say anything you want about Venezuela and people will believe it. I had people all day telling me people are eating rats, dogs, breaking into zoos and eating animals. Look, I see these headlines too. You have to read the articles because buried within these articles of these sensationalist headlines, you see the truth buried in the lead. The zookeeper denounced that statement. He said, no, they're not stealing animals to eat. They're stealing them to sell them on the black market. Why are you guys lying? And you have to ask a question, Mickey, when the corporate media is an extension of the Pentagon and they are purposely omitting, purposely obfuscating 50% of the story here. They are calling Maduro a dictator. They're saying that he's violently repressing millions of protesters in the street. They parroted that death toll, 170 killed by violent security forces in 2017. Guess what? I was there. I was in the middle of these protests. They were violent armed street battles. These Guarimba protesters were responsible for over half the deaths in the streets, lynchings, assassinations of socialists, black Chavistas, setting them on fire. They just set another body on fire a couple days ago. This is what they do. And people like Juan Guaido and Leopoldo Lopez encourage this and facilitate this so then they can create this international outcry and this kind of faux humanitarian crisis to foment regime change. It's a tale as old as time, but for some reason, people keep buying it.
So, Abby, it's very clear at this point that the corporate media and the U.S. military have chosen their sides, and they're with Juan Guaido, as you mentioned. What is it that Juan Guaido will do or allow to occur that Maduro wouldn't have?
This is really fascinating. Back in 1998, when Hugo Chavez was democratically elected, he was coming into a pretty abysmal economic situation. We're talking about a country that was ravaged by centuries of colonialism. Venezuela was an emerging failed state. It had inflation levels that are much worse than they are today. There were actual massacres of protesters in the street under Rafael Caldera, which was a U.S. puppet regime at the time. And that's kind of the situation that we saw Hugo Chavez rise to power. And he reflected the will of the people. He went in the barrios. He administered widespread social programs, really meant to uplift the poor. And indeed, you saw in the first couple of years of his presidency, millions of people lifted out of abject poverty. We saw homelessness plummet. Venezuela, until I think this year or last year, had the lowest homelessness rates in the entire hemisphere. And just widespread programs like CLAP, because a lot of people look at the economy of Venezuela and they say, oh, this is a failed socialist experiment. What they don't realize is that Maduro did not nationalize all of the industries. He nationalized the oil. He did not nationalize all of the paper product industries, the financial industries, and also the food product industries. And when you see these mass shortages, yes, there is a huge economic crisis going on in Venezuela. The thing is, anyone who's realistic and honest about Venezuela will tell you it's not that there's a mass shortage of all food products. It's that there's a mass shortage of certain food items and particular products like toilet paper. And then you look at who owns the circulation of these products. Then you realize in a mixed economy, there are still oligarchs that are alive and well, anti-Maduro CEOs who control and propagate the output of these products. That's just one aspect of this. Hugo Chavez threatened not only them, but of course the U.S. empire, right? Not only was his rhetoric very staunchly against U.S. imperialism, but he really wanted to uplift the poor, and his policies sought to do just that. Now, compared to today, it's funny that the media was painting Hugo Chavez as the exact same way that they paint Maduro. A dictator, corrupt, economic crisis. Really? Because back then oil was booming and there was no economic crisis. So why did the corporate media line never change from Chavez to Maduro? Now they can use kind of the rates of inflation to give their argument a little bit more bolstered. But it is interesting that the line has never changed because the corporate media sought out to make Maduro and Chavez illegitimate, even at a time when the economy was booming. And what Juan Guaido wants to do, to your point, Chase, we already know what he wants to do. They revealed their hand in 2002 with that first U.S.-backed coup. Again, Elliot Abrams was involved in that. The Bush administration was involved in that. They overthrew Hugo Chavez, kidnapped him at the barrel of a gun, and they immediately upended the Constitution, immediately sought to privatize that oil, and completely upend all of the social gains that Chavez put into place, housing programs, education, healthcare. Fast forward to today, Juan Guaido already has revealed his hand. Large-scale privatization efforts to completely remove all of the gains that have been done. People think it's hyperbolic to call this kind of a fascistic takeover. It is not, because we're talking about the largest, most active, most politically engaged social force in the country, which is Chavismo. And those are the people who voted Maduro in. If this guy wanted to win an election, he would have ran against Maduro last year. He chose not to. He's trying to appoint himself now, and he wants to rule and impose his rule to erase the voice of 6 million Chavistas. That's fascism.
There was a coup attempt led by the United States in Venezuela to overthrow Hugo Chavez, and that coup failed. And you might want to remind our listeners again that they did try, they denied it, but then it didn't happen.
It didn't happen, Mickey, because, first of all, you need the military behind you if you want to install a U.S. puppet with the military for a military coup to be successful. And Chavez was a military man. He came from the military. He utilized the military in order to win himself. And you still see that allegiance, that strong allegiance with Maduro today. And that's why you saw Vladimir Petrino, who I was actually lucky enough to confront myself. People call me a puppet for the Venezuelan government because I sold a show to Telesur. Oddly enough, I never had any editorial interference whatsoever. I was able to confront their defense minister about everything that corporate media is painting about him. I doubt you could say the same about Trump and his cabinet. So, yeah, that coup failed, Mickey. Obviously so, A, because of the military, and B, because the masses would not sit down. They were in the street. They were crowding around the jail that they were holding him. I mean, they just would not let it go. And it was very clear at that point that the coup was not going to be successful. But it is very funny how the New York Times wrote about that coup. They immediately recognized whoever the U.S. was trying to impose at the time and called him a distinguished businessman, and at the same time discarded Hugo Chavez as, of course, a communist dictator.
And there are several outlets now that are covering, not many, but there are covering what's happening in Venezuela. And of course, you've been making the rounds a lot of different places. And of course, on Media Roots, you dissect these things at the Real News Network, realnews.com. You've been doing some of this as well. Let's come up to the present and the Trump administration and have you talk to us a little bit more about what's going on and what you think is happening in the Trump administration supporting this coup.
This would never have happened without a green light and facilitation from the Trump administration directly. And let's just bring it back to that coup in 2002. That was obviously a very brazen attempt to replace Hugo Chavez. We know that Venezuela has always been a thorn in the side of U.S. empire, not only for its rhetoric, but because of its robust socialist experiment. Not countering, not laying down, not bowing down to U.S. capitalism and hegemony and militarism. So, of course, it was always on the radar of the U.S. government. That's why it was so interesting that it's kind of left alone for a little bit until the Obama administration in 2015 randomly declared Venezuela a national security threat and slapped about 6 or 7 sanctions on the country, very out of the blue, very weird. But then Trump really has taken it to a completely unprecedented level. And before we get into what he's done with this specific coup, I mean, right when he got into office, he set laser sights on Latin America. I think days after getting inaugurated, he invited Leopoldo Lopez's wife to the White House, a clear signal to the opposition that, hey, I have your back and I'm going to facilitate everything I can to get you guys in power. And just over the last 2 years, what Trump has done has completely debilitated and crushed Venezuela's economy. I mean, he has slapped 63 sanctions at least on Venezuela on top of the 7 that Obama did. And people like to think of sanctions as kind of a soft power. No, sanctions are war. Sanctions are an act of war, and they hurt the most vulnerable, poor, working-class sectors of any respective population. It's not just corrupt government elites. It's the poor people who can't get access to food and medicine. And when you're talking about a country like Venezuela that basically thrives on oil revenue and survives on imports and exports, yeah, that's a big deal when they order insulin and the U.S. government's blocking insulin shipments to them. That's genocidal. And look no further than what happened in Iraq when 500,000 babies died from dysentery-related illness because of the U.S. sanctions there. And you heard Madeleine Albright justify that as well. It was worth it. Venezuela needs to trade with their oil. You need to trade oil with U.S. dollars. The U.S. is, the largest economic force in the world, and it bends countries to its will through economic means. And sanctions are just one of these fronts. And the sanctions on Venezuela have completely destroyed its ability to recover economically. They can't take out loans. They can't borrow. They can't sell oil in U.S. dollars. So all of these things have a major, major impact in Venezuela. And when you couple that with the plummeting of just oil prices a couple of years ago, yeah, there's going to be a huge economic crisis. But guess what? They can't pick themselves back up with the things that the U.S. administration has done to cripple them. And, of course, this is completely obfuscated, right? We don't talk about the economic war. We don't talk about the economic war being waged within the country or external forces waging an economic war or what sanctions do to exacerbate the situation. And Trump, rhetorically aside from threatening Venezuela every time they do anything, this coup, again, you saw John Bolton threatening a couple months ago when he slapped more sanctions on Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. He called it the troika of tyranny. And that really reminded me eerily of the axis of evil, because they want to do to Latin America what they did to the Middle East. And they're doing it. And they are dressing up this coup in constitutional garb, which is funny considering the same opposition group who's now installing themselves as the new leadership of this country just tried to blow Maduro up on stage with C4 explosives a couple months ago. So why are they now pretending to be such law-abiding constitutionalists when they just tried to assassinate him mere weeks ago.
Well, Abby Martin, it's interesting. Kevin Gostola over at shadowproof.com, who's been a guest on the show a number of times, actually has an interesting article. CNN goes undercover to manufacture consent for coup attempt in Venezuela, where he talks about a CNN, quote, exclusive report from inside Venezuela, airing it multiple times on January 28 as a prime example, quote, of how influential media outlets in the U.S. effectively create propaganda for the opposition there, which is now receiving funds from President Donald Trump's administration. And so CNN is basically embedding itself in the midst of what's happening there and really obfuscating what's happening and really trying to tip the scales.
Exactly. And one last thing about the Trump administration, Mike Pence called Juan Guaido the day before he declared himself president and told him, go ahead. And we know that he's been in talks with Juan Guaido for months. And we know that they've been meeting with the opposition for months. And we know that they've been given tens of millions of dollars from the U.S. empire for years to try to foment this. And what Guaido represents is an end to that socialist experiment. He represents the downfall, the opening up of markets so the U.S. can pillage them, as John Bolton so plainly stated earlier. But yeah, CNN, it doesn't matter what corporate media outlet you're looking at. They're all saying the same things. Some of them mask it in faux humanitarianism, right? Their interventionism and faux humanitarianism. But let's just face it, to be hired at these news outlets, it's naive to not understand how they work, Mickey, and I know that you know this better than anyone. But look, to work at these news outlets, you need to believe in the myth of American exceptionalism. You need to believe the U.S. empire is a benign force and that its deeds are done out of goodwill. And if you don't believe that, you wouldn't be able to work there, right? And if you question that narrative, if you try to pave some sort of editorial freedom, like let's say they go to Venezuela, they see the massive pro-government marches that are being censored from our media deliberately. If they tried to tell their bosses or producers, they would get squashed. That would get erased. We know that's how it works. They like to paint outlets like RT, Telesur, Al Jazeera as puppet media outlets that have to parrot the line of dictators. No, actually, there's more editorial freedom at state media by far than there is at corporate media, especially when it comes to towing that bipartisan foreign policy consensus. Anything that's done to maintain the empire is agreed upon uniformly. And the second you buck that, that's when all hell breaks loose. We already know what happened to Phil Donahue for questioning the Iraq War. You cannot question the motivations of the U.S. empire or the militaristic presence, these 800 bases, the fact that there's special operations in 70% of the world's nations. No, don't question any of that, and you'll be just fine where you are. And one more thing about just kind of the NGOs' role, because it might sound cartoonish or absurd to suggest that, Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch is somehow complicit in parroting regime change narratives, but indeed they are, because a lot of these organizations get sought out by opposition figures, right? Opposition figures who are closely tied to U.S. think tanks, NGOs, and also politicians in the U.S. They have a direct line and stream of communication with them. So just by default, a lot of the Chavistas get ignored. A lot of the opposition violence gets completely ignored from these human rights, quote-unquote, reports. We know with that famous story, the babies out of the incubators that paved the way for the first Gulf War, we know that Amnesty and Human Rights Watch bought that hook, line, and sinker as well. They actually said there were hundreds of babies thrown out of incubators. So we have to kind of question whenever we're seeing these things coming at us full force in that uniform fashion. And I hear all the time, listen to Venezuelans, right? Listen to the Venezuelans. Look, through NED, through USAID, we have to understand the social media operation as well and the construction of these social media narratives, whether it be correcting the record on Israel. We know that there's universities that employ war rooms there in Tel Aviv to edit Wikipedia and argue with people on social media. So I don't take Venezuelans on Twitter as kind of like the ultimate truth. And a lot of these people are sock puppet accounts, obviously. And you have to also speculate how much money is being fed from the opposition and also the U.S. government to monitor that online and to kind of create this false notion that the majority of Venezuelans agree with an undemocratic coup.
So, Abby, I know you've done a lot of on-the-ground reporting in Venezuela, but you're not there right now. Who can our audience turn to try to get some of that on-the-ground video or articles? Who can we turn to for that on-the-ground reporting?
The Venezuelans that we need to be hearing from are the poor Afro-Venezuelans, the indigenous Venezuelans, the working-class Venezuelans who are in the streets, who are being covered by outlets like Telesur, which is not only funded by the Venezuelan government, but by 4 or 5 other Latin American countries, and outlets like Venezuela Analysis. They are rigorously reporting on a daily basis, out in the streets, doing man on the streets, giving an honest assessment about what's going on. These are Venezuelans who are left-wing, who are PSUV-oriented, or just at least not taking the opposition side, and they give a very accurate assessment of reality, and they don't sugarcoat anything, but they do give the truth, and they give both sides. And it's very, very important to support outlets like that and watch and listen to outlets like that, because, again, the corporate media cannot be trusted on this, and media who are deliberately ignoring and censoring what we know exists as another side of the story cannot be trusted, and I cannot stress that enough. They cannot be trusted. So please, media literacy is a very important tool for all of us. We need to understand how we're being propagandized to, how these narratives and regime change operations are being fed to us, because these can't happen without the complicity of the U.S. public. The Iraq War would not have happened unless the people were behind it, because the media was paving that complicity for months. And they're doing the same thing here. And if this really was about a starving nation or humanitarian intervention, we would be invading Yemen, and we would be invading Haiti, which is by far the most impoverished country in the region. So you have to ask yourself and kind of poke holes through these narratives.
Indeed, Abby Martin, and it's also just amazing to watch over places like MSNBC. In one segment, it's talking about the evils of Russia meddling in other countries' elections, and then they skip over to the next segment where they're cheerleading the coup in Venezuela. It's pretty riveting stuff. I'm very glad you mentioned VenezuelaAnalysis.com. I was going to tack that on there, but I figured you would mention it. A source that we at Project Censored have long looked to. And also, Abby Martin, you're one of the great sources that we look to, and all the great work you do with the Empire Files, and previously our guest Manar Mahawish of Mint Press News. So, Abby, I wanted to thank you again for everything you're doing, and thank you for taking time out of your schedule to talk to us about this very important issue that's being heavily skewed, where we're being heavily propagandized by the corporate media here in the United States and in the West. So, Abby Martin, thank you so much for joining the Project Censored show.
Thank you so much for having me, Mickey, and please don't take my word for it. We have all of this evidence and facts, and all of the Venezuelan people speaking for themselves on our YouTube channel, Empire Files, and on our Twitters, Abby Martin and Michael Preisner. So please check that out. Don't take my word for it. Find the truth out for yourself, you guys. Really appreciate it.